Obviously, there's a great deal of trouble going on, a lot of troubled people in this country. It was interesting recently. My wife had flown up to be here in Washington for the president's speech on the White House grounds, and flying back, she noticed there were people with the BLM, Black Lives Matter, paraphernalia, things on there saying BLM, Black Lives Matter, and it was interesting to hear apparently some of the comments, and the comments had to do with the free plane tickets they got to fly up to protest here. The one person said, yeah, they got a free minivan the whole time they were here. Somebody is paying for those items to come up and threaten and assault. Thankfully, there weren't near as many batteries with actual physical part of the assault, just threatened assaults. My wife and I, when we left the White House grounds up from the closed Pennsylvania part, trying to get down to our car in front of the Willard, we ended up being chased by a mob, and the mob was on its way, and they were very loud and aggressive as they ran toward us. And so I thought, we'll cut through the Willard, and because I knew we'd never make it all the way around the next block. There was a door there, glass door, and I kept knocking on the door, and there were people at the other end of the hall. They could see us. Nobody would come open the door. And finally, the mob was getting closer as they were running toward us, and I said, look, if they get here before this door gets open, you go ahead around the corner. I'm sure they'll be all enthralled with beating me. I don't think they'll come after you. Just get around the block. There's police at the other end of the next block. Just get there while they're after me. Don't try to stay and defend me. But out of nowhere, this guy just comes up behind me. He worked for the Willard, scanned his card, opened the door right before the crowd got there. But it's just amazing, you know, who wants to inflict violence like that? And more particularly, who is it that's funding people to come up and create havoc like that? There's an article by Catherine Gorka a couple of days ago in the Federalist entitled How the 1960s Riots Foreshadow Today's Communist Weaponization of Black Pain. Clearly there's been pain in this country. George Floyd's death was so unnecessary. It was outrageous. But who is paying, who is stirring up all this violence to create more pain, more suffering, more damage? It's a question worth finding an answer for. And I've thought numerous times about David Horowitz. I introduced him to someone some years back and said he used to be a socialist. And David, now 80, said, Louie, I wasn't a socialist, I was a communist. I was a complete communist, man. And David has written before about his turn from being a communist in the 60s. And one of the things that he had said hit him very hard was they were preparing for protests, and someone else was trying to encourage efforts to make the police overreact so that they would hurt one of them. And David didn't want anybody to get hurt or killed. And he was told, we want the police to kill somebody because then we can ramp it up and they won't be able to stop us. Well, he never signed on to get somebody killed. But if you study the Marxist revolution going back to 1917, October Revolution. Of course, there was one earlier that year, but the Bolsheviks weren't the strongest party, the group of people at that time. There are so many things that could have gone wrong, but one thing they wanted to do, it's right out of the Marxist playbook, create such chaos that your little group may have a chance to weasel into power and take over. And we're seeing a lot of that play out in this country. Fortunately, we have people in authority in the federal government, at least most places in the federal government in this administration, not all. We could improve some of the president's appointments who didn't turn out quite as strong as we had hoped. But we got to get to the bottom of who is paying, who is trying to get this thing all stirred up. This article from yesterday, Washington Times, Jeff Murdoch, Attorney General William Barr told federal prosecutors last week to charge violent demonstrators with a range of offenses, including sedition, charge usually reserved for someone plotting to overthrow the government. But that bears looking back at the federal sedition charge. 18 U.S. Code 2384 is seditious conspiracy. Some people I hear talk about this is treason. Well, if you look at treason both in Constitution Article 3, Section 3, it's more about levying war against the United States government. 18 U.S.C. 2381 is treason, and it's giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. So it's a tough go. But if you look at the seditious conspiracy, two or more persons in any state or territory or in any place subject to jurisdiction of the United States conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war, or to oppose by force the authority thereof. Now, that comes into play, some of the things that have happened. And then it says, or by force prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, contrary to the authority thereof, they shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 20 years or both. So that could very well come into play. And Madam Speaker, I bring it up, hoping that those who think it's just fun to create havoc, maybe throw Molotov cocktails or even pay for them or help supply them, help fund people that are going to come throw them or create havoc, you're looking at 20 years just under that statute alone. And some have said, and I was thinking this, I know under the doctrine of posse comitatus from my days in the Army, and since then, some people are confused about the doctrine. They say the president can never commit troops against American people, but we saw the Clinton administration utilize vehicles, equipment that had to have people helping from Fort Bliss, as I understand it from back in those days, that ended up leading to the death of, can't remember, 70, 80 people there outside of Waco. But the president can, but he has to do it himself. That was one of the confusing things back then. President Clinton, as I recall, was asked about it, said something like, oh, that's Reno's deal. Well, you couldn't utilize what was utilized against the David Koresh with his confused personality, problematic as it was. Even that, you couldn't use military resources without the president's approval. So we never found out how in the world the orders were given if the president himself didn't give it. That was a violation of the law. But here in 10 U.S. Code 253, says the President, by using the militia, the armed forces, or both, or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in any state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. But you note the words domestic violence. It goes on, if one so hinders the execution of the laws of that state and of the United States within the state, that any part or class of its people are deprived of right, privilege, immunity, or protection, namely the Constitution, secured by law. So it's wide open to being used in some of these riots where people's life, liberty, and certainly their property is not being protected. It's being overwhelmed. I think the President is right to give governors and mayors the chance to protect their people, but at some point, if it's not done, this ought to make clear to those governors and mayors that aren't protecting their people. The President has authority to send in people to put down this, what appears to be sedition, this violence. It really is Marxist violence. And if you look at Black Lives Matter, it says in their title Black Lives Matter, but if you look at what they're in favor of, it's not about Black Lives Matter. It's things like destroying the family. Now, of course, BLM calls it the Western-style family, and that alone is just completely fiction. The families we have traditionally known in the United States since our very inception, they weren't Western style. These were Middle Eastern. These came from Moses, and for Christians or Jews that believe what Moses said was inspired or provided by God. He said, a man shall leave his father and mother, a woman leave her home, the two will become one. And, years later, Jesus is asked about marriage and divorce. He quotes Moses verbatim and then adds the line, what God's joined together, let nobody separate. But so it's not, we didn't come up with that type of marriage. It's not Western style. We have to give credit where credit's due. It's Middle Eastern style. It's from Moses. It's from Jesus. So can't really take credit for that. But then again, when you're a Marxist group dedicated toward overthrow of the government and replacing it with a socialist, communist, progressive, whatever you want to call it, that's the way they go. That is the direction. You destroy the history, so you can't learn from prior mistakes. You can't learn from prior successes. You just rewrite the history, and Orwell had a lot to say about that. A study, as this article from the Federalist points out by Joy Pullman, up to 95% of 2020 U.S. riots are linked to Black Lives Matter. And that's quite a good article and quite informative. But then this article by Edward Morrow, pro-communist China group funding Black Lives Matter linked organization. And it points out that pro-communist China group, the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco, is actively funding a venture by Black Lives Matter co-founder and unabashedly anti-capitalist Alicia Garza. Another article from Peter Hassan from 2 days ago points out that Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza in 2015 said capitalism must be abolished for Black lives to matter. So basically, they're pushing for the destruction of our Constitution-based government, and they're creating all kinds of chaos. So it shouldn't have surprised anybody who saw the article yesterday, Douglas Ernst, that Jesus' statue that's 90 years old was destroyed at St. Patrick's Cathedral in El Paso, quotes here is I'm in shock, but that's what socialists, communists, progressives push. And if you look at what communists, socialists have done, it's clear you have to get rid of any belief in anything except the government. And that I mentioned before, but when I was an exchange student in the Soviet Union, there were 8 Americans that summer, and we from the U.S., and going to the city of, or the former city, it was the only recognized Christian seminary in the Soviet Union at the time, in Zagorsk. But there was a building, as you were to turn into the walled area there of Zagorsk, building there with a painting of Lenin's face, and above it Lenin, and below it Znamie. Lenin is with us. So you may be turning in here to learn about Jesus, but just remember, it's Lenin that's with us, nobody else. And that's the message. It was kind of actually made me nauseous to go in an old church in Moscow that had a stained glass window, big, gorgeous colors, and instead of Jesus with all the children suffering to come unto him, it was Lenin sitting, as Jesus is often depicted, surrounded by the children. It was a bit sickening to go into the massive cathedral there in what was then it was St. Petersburg originally, then it became Leningrad, but that gorgeous, massive cathedral had been converted to the Museum of Atheism and Evolution. Just incredible. But that's where this all has to go if you're going to have a successful destruction of the freedoms we have and go to government control, government ownership, no private property. That's where it all ends up if we don't get it stopped. And it will mean the end of the country that afforded the greatest opportunities individually, the greatest assets individually, the highest standard of living. It's tragic that we have poverty in the United States, tragic that we still have any homelessness at all. That hadn't apparently improved a whole lot since the war on poverty started trillions of dollars ago. But even so, we still had the highest standard of living and opportunities, I would submit, in history. And it's what freedom and private property has brought: innovation, greatest innovation in the history of the world. But that's all in jeopardy right now. And Americans better wake up. It's all at risk. These Marxist revolutionaries need to be stopped. It is sedition. It is a violation of federal and most state law. And it's time to put it to an end. And if the governors and mayors who've been allowing this to go on, depriving Americans of their life, liberty, pursuit of happiness on their own property, then it will be time for the president to use these federal statutes to step in and bring peace to the country once again, so we can go through our lives without worrying about being chased by a mob that's upset with you just because you went and heard a speech. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Pursuant to Section 4B of House Resolution 967, the House stands adjourned until noon tomorrow.